Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Aja Umiwaliri, and I'm the Associate Director of the African Studies Center here at UNC Chapel Hill. Thank you all the panelists, and special thanks to Rudy Colorado Mansfield for his continued support of the center. Lastly, thank you to the team, Emily Burrell, my boss and the director of the center, as well as Stacy Sewell and Nazrit Tibebu. Before we launch into today's session, please note that this session is being recorded and it's broadcast live on Facebook, and you can find it at UNC Africa. It's a Facebook page. Today's session will run as follows. There will be introductions and remarks from all the panelists, and then we'll take questions. You can use the Q&A box on the bottom right of the screen to send in your questions ahead. Panelists as well can ask questions of each other. The African Studies Center has been working on creating digital contents for the center's work to support the teaching and work of our faculty and the learning of our students. And one of such projects was developing videos explaining the Sustainable Development Goals called the SDGs. Over the summer, we decided to start with, we broke them in batches, and we started with the first 6 videos. These videos having finalized, and they showcase updates, background on the SDGs in Africa, but highlights the work that our faculty here at UNC Chapel Hill are doing, have done, or continue to do supporting each of the goals. So each goal is showcasing one faculty and their work. You can find the 6 videos on our YouTube channel, and our channel is UNC African Studies Center on YouTube. Right now, I'll hand over to our Senior Associate Dean, Rudy, for his comments, as well as to introduce our keynote address speaker, Dr. Raymond Gilpin.
Terrific, thanks, Ada, and thanks very much to the African Studies Center for organizing this session. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Raymond Gilpin in this panel on the Sustainable Development Goals and the work of the Regional Bureau for Africa of the UN Development Program. This campus is home to a lot of healthy debates about development, human rights, alternatives to development. This semester, I myself have been fortunate to be able to sit in on several classes of another colleague of ours, Professor Eunice Saleh, who in the course of her class has welcomed guest speakers ranging from justices of the Kenyan Supreme Court to a young agricultural entrepreneur who's establishing a model for widespread commercial avocado production for smallhold farmers, all in the context of human rights and development. I'm a cultural anthropologist by training, and in my home department, we have been privileged for years to be led in these discussions by Professor Arturo Escobar, who's taught a challenging set of courses that have brought thinkers from across South America to take up this conversation and to share with us alternative ideas for measures of economic development. And it's amid this legacy that we are privileged today to welcome Dr. Raymond Gilpin to lead us in this discussion about the Sustainable Development Goals. Dr. Gilpin is Chief Economist and Head of Strategy and Analysis in the research team at the Regional Bureau for Africa at the United Nations Development Program in New York. In this capacity, he provides leadership on all matters related to economic analysis, strategy, research, and manages the RBA network on economists. Prior to joining the UNDP, he was the academic dean at the African Center for Strategic Studies in Washington, D.C., and economics director at the United States Institute for Peace, where he also chaired the task force on business and peace and managed the web-based international network for economics and conflict. He has also worked at the African Development Bank and the World Bank. Dr. Gilpin was inducted into the Martin Luther King Collegium of Scholars at the historic Morehouse College in Atlanta in 2015 in recognition of his work on economics and peace, and he holds a doctorate from Cambridge University in the UK. So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Gilpin today for him to start this discussion off.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thanks to the leadership and staff at the Africa Studies Center for including UNDP in this conversation. I just ask if my screen sharing could be enabled, so I could share a few slides. Pleased to be able to talk to you today a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals, Africa's development prospects, and a little bit about what's been going on regarding the COVID pandemic and how this is forcing us to rethink economic development in Africa. Before COVID, this was pretty much the story. Africa was a continent on the move. We've seen sustained economic growth since the mid-1990s. Between 2000 and 2016, Africa's GDP grew by 25%. Contrary to a lot of popular notions, roughly half of Africa's countries are either middle or high income. The rising household incomes over the last couple of decades is creating a vibrant middle class across the continent. As far as natural resource endowment is concerned, 30% of all global mineral reserves are found on the continent. And it is no surprise that we're seeing returns on foreign direct investment in Africa being above the global average. In spite of all of the promise, a lot of stubborn challenges persist. Crime and corruption, for instance. Just a couple of weeks ago, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development released a report that showed that illicit financial flows out of Africa total $89 billion every year. Violent conflict remains a problem, as do weak institutions and infrastructure gaps. And it is in this context that we want to talk about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. These are goals, they're aspirations, but the overarching aim of the SDGs is to ensure that the economic fortunes of countries and the welfare and well-being of every individual African is affected positively during what has been called a decade of action. And during this time, there's a lot of work to accelerate the Sustainable Development Goals. And these goals are a compact that involves not just African governments and donors, but African citizens, African businesses, and the broad range of Africa's development partners. And underlying the SDGs is the reality that economic development is not just about income growth and GDP. It's about what I call the 4 Ps: the people, the profits, the planet, and principles like equality, inclusion, integrity. Just suffice to also mention that the SDGs are consistent with the African Union's Agenda 2063. Early this year, in January, before COVID, the Brookings Institution did a review of Africa's progress with the 17 SDGs and found out that even though no country is on track to attain all 17, most countries are making steady progress. UNDP supports African countries, and in January this year, we released what we call our strategic offer in Africa. Not a strategy, it is an offer that articulates how we, UNDP, could utilize our 6 impact areas based on 6 foundational enablers to help African countries invest in their people, invest in infrastructure, and invest in technology that would enable them to make progress in attaining the SDGs. But then there was COVID. As of this morning, some 1.4 million cases in Africa. This has been an enigma because although Africa accounts for 17% of the world's population, it accounts for less than 3% of global COVID cases. And we are seeing a concentration with 10 countries accounting for 83% of the total cases, and one country accounting for almost half. So on the healthcare side, it's not been as challenging as we had anticipated, but it has still been quite daunting, largely because when you think about flattening the curve in Africa, because Africa's healthcare capacity is so much lower than the global average, flattening the curve means an almost flat curve. So even a really small uptick in the epidemiology could have catastrophic effects across the continent. But what's been challenging Africa right now are the socioeconomic issues, the GDP losses, the job losses, increasing debt, price volatility, weakened demand for Africa's exports. For the first time in decades, probably centuries, Africa is facing a shock on the demand side and the supply side simultaneously, at a time when its leading development and trading partners are also going through the same thing. And so all of this brings into stark reality the challenges African countries are going to face as they try to address the SDGs. This is why the UN system published in April this year the framework for immediate socioeconomic response to COVID-19. This document is based on 5 pillars, and these pillars are basically trying to stem the flow, trying to address the key immediate issues that African countries are facing. Subsequently, UNDP published Beyond Recovery. And the reality was that the immediate challenges are real, but the longer term challenges also have to be addressed. And this has been based on 4 pillars: social protection, governance, the green economy, and digital disruption. And it is our estimation that as Africa looks beyond the present to the future, these are 4 areas that they need to countries and the population need to focus on if they're going to address some of the key socioeconomic issues. And all of this is underpinned by an assets-based approach. When we generally think about what poverty is and how to develop economies, we think about aid and handouts. We think about how do we address the immediate cash flow challenges that countries and families are facing, and not how do we ensure that household incomes become resilient and households have assets that could help them address the key challenges. So all of this having been said, African countries are now at a point where they're looking forward. How do they get over COVID-19 and get back on track to address the SDGs? There are 4 things I'd like to mention very quickly. The first is efforts to contain the spread of the pandemic. Most African countries mimicked what was happening elsewhere: lockdowns, quarantines. But the cultural reality is that the labor market in African countries, 75% is non-formal. So if people can't go out every day to earn money, not just the economy stalls, but families suffer as well. The cultural realities of social distancing, or in areas where you have high population density. Second, providing social protection. Job losses and the socioeconomic issues have forced African countries, on average, as of a couple of months ago, African countries have set aside 3% of GDP for social protection. But it's basically mimicking what's happening elsewhere. Cash transfers. On a continent where most People do not have wage jobs. Most people are not documented in the labor force. Cash transfers leave many behind. There's also the fiscal sustainability challenge of non-contributory social protection measures. Then in April, May, we had the G20 countries offer debt relief for countries. And it was basically a suspension of debt repayment so that governments would have funds to invest in the social sectors, particularly health and education. But the issue is that a lot of this debt relief approach focuses on the liquidity issue, not the solvency issues that have arisen from the twin demand and supply shocks. So it's not only temporary, it is very grossly inadequate. And secondly, the debt relief only goes to low-income countries. As I mentioned, a lot of African countries are middle income. So what about them? And because most of them have Eurobonds, they're not participating in debt relief because they don't want their credit ratings to be affected. And so the countries are suffering because it has not been tailored sufficiently for them. And the last thing I want to mention is there's been a lot of talk about building back stronger. It was Winston Churchill who said, never waste a good crisis. This is not an opportunity to build back stronger. It's an opportunity to build forward smarter, more sustainably, and in a manner that ensures that everybody benefits and nobody is left behind. And so these are some of the issues that have challenged us. First of all, how do we reimagine Africa's development post-COVID in an environment where regional integration, regional trade is going to become more important than external trade? How do we reconfigure the aid and trade architecture so that African countries can trade their way out of challenges and not be perpetually aid dependent? How do we reconceptualize social contract theory? And so that the taxes and the abilities of African governments are focused on rebuilding state-society relationships? How could we reposition Africa's private sector as agents of change and not have economies that are solely dependent on government contracts? And in this context, how do we ensure that technology, skills, and digitization become a lot more than just mobile telephony across Africa? How do we reevaluate Africa's governance, security, development nexus, and so that development, security, and governance are not on different tracks, but they become mutually supporting? How do we recalibrate Africa's external relationships, and so that dependency and unfair trade become things of the past, so that multilateralism works for Africa, and so that Africa's new continental free trade area project is able to deliver not just the almost $7 trillion market in about 2 or 3 decades, but is able to translate that into tangible development gains. And so that the 168 million Africans whose food security issues have pushed them into new areas of vulnerability would be able to claw their way out of extreme poverty. These are some of the issues that we have to, that we are seeking to address. And from a UN perspective, we're seeking to address this, not just by doing things, but trying to reimagine what the norms should be on the African continent in the 21st century. thank you very much for giving me some time to share some of my thoughts, and I look forward to your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you, Raymond. I'm sure faculty and the audience might have questions, and we would fill them at the end of the session with the rest of the panelists. I'd like to point out that we do have several faculty who are doing work related to all the goals, but for the purpose of the video, we decided to focus and highlight just one faculty. So for goal 1, which is no poverty and aims at ending poverty in all forms everywhere by 2035, we showcased the work of Professor Handa Shudanshu. Professor Handa is Kenan Eminent Professor of Public Policy at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. He is one of the principal investigators for a UNICEF-funded project called the Transfer Project. He received his BA in Political Economy from the Johns Hopkins University and a PhD in Economics from the University of Toronto. The Transfer Project is a multi-country research initiative on the impact of national cash transfer programs on households and children in sub-Saharan Africa. Using research, Professor Handa and his team provide evidence on the effectiveness of large-scale national cash transfer programs in Africa. And using that same evidence through dialogue and learning with stakeholders, they inform the development of new cash transfer policies and social protection policies in 10 African countries. Thank you for joining us, Handa, Professor Handa. Can you share with us updates on your research as well as your interests and challenges, especially how COVID has affected it?
Great, thank you so much for inviting me. And it's really nice to meet you, Dr. Gilpin. So as mentioned, our work here at UNC is in partnership with UNICEF, in particular the regional offices in Eastern and Southern Africa, and then in Western and Central Africa. So the Transfer Project has really worked, with UNICEF and the FAO to provide evidence on the effectiveness of cash transfers, so of social protection, and that was one of the 4 pillars mentioned by Dr. Gilpin, right, in terms of the response to COVID, and cash transfers in particular, which is something that he also mentioned. Our work has really helped sort of change the dialogue around cash transfers from that of sort of handouts and dependency, which was referred to in the presentation, to one of inclusive development and thinking about the rights and what it means to be a citizen and the claims that citizens might have on the state, right? And in fact, the evidence has showed that, far from being a handout, in fact, recipients of cash transfers in these large government programs are extremely efficient with the money, not only boosting their own food security and consumption, but investing the little that they have in livestock, improving their farm productivity, buying fertilizer, sending kids to school. So it's really shown governments, how they can achieve inclusive development through a fairly simple instrument. And sort of as testimony to that, since we started work, we've seen huge scale ups in countries like Malawi, in Ghana, in Kenya, in Zambia. In Zambia, the cash transfer, the national program reaches 18% of the population. In Malawi, it's approaching 10% and so on. So that's been pretty exciting, and that work is ongoing. The work right now around COVID, and as again was mentioned by Dr. Gilpin, is that cash transfers have been sort of one of the key policy responses to the short-term effects of COVID, right? And our work right now in the Transfer Project is pretty exciting in this area as well. We are developing a dashboard, a 20-country dashboard right now, which simulates different cash transfer responses to different COVID-type shocks, right? And so it allows, it's a very useful hands-on tool that allows governments to see, okay, the COVID shock is occurring in my country in this sector of this intensity. a cash transfer of this type targeted to this sector will do, will do this and so on. And so that's what the current work is doing now. I think just keeping track of my time, making sure I don't use up, take more than. So one of the things that coming up in that work, and the dashboard is under construction. Like I said, it's for 20 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Again, it's a partnership with UNICEF, again, through the 2 regional offices. One of the things that's coming up, and as we develop the results for each country, we've been meeting individually with countries, through the ministries of social welfare or social development, to sort of explain the results and talk them through. And one of the things that's coming up is that the effects of COVID are primarily felt in population groups that are not the poorest, right? So for example, urban service sector or retail trade, okay, is a big group that's affected. And these are not the poorest households. And this is raising a very real policy dilemma right now in terms of the response, right? Because most programs, cash transfer programs, are highly targeted to the ultra poor, and yet the ones that are most affected are not that group. And so this is a bit of a dilemma that's coming up that we're working through with governments in terms of trying to figure out how to tailor the response, right? So I think I'm going to leave it at that, just to I think that gives you a nice idea of what we're working on now. And again, really nice to meet you, Dr. Gilpin, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Handa. For goal 2, it would be Professor Colin Thor-West, who unfortunately cannot join us today because he's in class. But Professor West has worked directly to support goals 2. And goal 2 is zero hunger. Professor Colin Thor-West is an associate professor here at UNC. He has a BA in anthropology and an MA and PhD in anthropology from the University of Arizona. Professors Colin Thor-West from the anthropology department here at UNC and Aaron Moody, geography department at UNC as well, worked with a team of undergraduate and graduate students to understand vegetation dynamics in the Sahelian region of Burkina Faso in West Africa. This project is funded by the National Science Foundation, and it's titled Factors Influencing Vegetation Trends in Dryland Zones, and it contributes directly to Goal 2's targets 2.3 and 2.4. Over the summer of 2019, Colin Thor-West and graduate students Alfredo Rojas and Kofi Nomeji from Duke University, and Alfredo is here at UNC. They both conducted field work in farming communities to understand what and who is contributing to regreening. Local communities practice soil and water conservation strategies to improve the quality of the soil in the Sahelian region of Burkina Faso. Since the summer, Colin and his students have been analyzing fieldwork data to create web maps, as well as reinterpret satellite imagery through the perspectives of local community members. Their data is still being analyzed, but some preliminary findings suggest that the soil and water conservation practices contribute to regreening. Progress on this research was affected by COVID-19, and they're currently trying to publish some of their results in some anthropology and geography journals. So that's a brief highlight on Goal 2 and our faculty member who's working directly to support that goal. Goal 3 is good health and hunger, and it aims to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Dr. Royce Boyce is an assistant professor at UNC Chapel Hill's School of Medicine with the Division of Infectious Diseases. Ross's research focuses on the epidemiology of malaria and vector-borne diseases in East Africa. Particularly, he works in rural underserved communities. Ross received his MD from UNC Chapel Hill and holds an MSc from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Ross's research focuses, I already said that, Currently, Dr. Boyce has two areas of active investigation. The first is an evaluation of multiple antigen rapid diagnostic tests to provide a semi-quantitative estimate of parasite density. His second area of investigation is the use of geographic information systems to describe the spatial epidemiology of malaria and eventually identify and target hotspots, and that would help in community-based interventions. Boyce will utilize geographic profiling in his National Institute of Health's malaria research funded project to map malaria cases in Western Uganda. He's also working on projects to determine the efficacy of paid malaria testing and methods of increasing childhood immunizations in Uganda. And it's funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I'll invite Ross to share his work with us.
So thank you for the introduction, and thank you for allowing me to be here today. I'm obviously representing a large swath of investigators on the health side of the campus who work in across the continent, really, in a number of established sites, of which I'm only one. So in looking through the SDGs, and especially in 3, what you see are kind of two main foci that I think I struggle with quite a bit in my work in Uganda. In the early sort of SDGs, the 3.1, 2, 3, 4, really are almost epidemic control. And this is talking about a lot of the things that are more well known. So this is the HIV, the malaria, tuberculosis, and perhaps a bit neglected viral hepatitis, which I think still needs a lot of attention. And as you move down the list, what you see are perhaps the more pressing crises, which are around establishing universal primary care, access to care, safe delivery, water, smoking cessation, alcoholism, injury and violence prevention. And in some ways, I think that's a very challenging thing to do, because you are essentially trying to build the airplane while flying it and tackle all of these issues of HIV and malaria. And now those things are being complicated by COVID. And from my own experience, working in a very rural area, one of the main problems is that there are not existing models of sort of longitudinal care. Most people, when they come to a clinic, it's because they're ill. They may get diagnosed or treated and get better, and that's the end of sort of their interaction with the health system. We don't have good models for keeping people engaged in care, which I think creates a lot of missed opportunities for education, not only on health, but other programs as well. I think there are definitely advantages in the systems that exist. For example, the network of community health workers in rural Uganda is particularly strong and provides a lot. But one of the things that we've seen recently, for example, to give you kind of a sense of what we're dealing with is in the midst of the COVID lockdowns recently at our site, we had some severe flooding. And this is undoubtedly a result of climate change that's happening across the region, but particularly in the East African highlands. And the glaciers on top of the Ruwenzori Mountains are slowly receding. And with the seasonal rains that come each year, you see massive mudslides that cause destruction, destroy crops. Coffee is the major cash crop in our area. And that flooding has occurred. This is the second major flood since 2013 that has displaced thousands of people. And as if that weren't enough, in the middle of COVID, when everyone is locked down, we see malaria spike after flooding. And that's because you get increased surface water across these areas where there wasn't surface water before. You get mosquitoes breeding. And unfortunately, because of COVID, there was a real limitation in the response. So typically at times like this, you might see massive bed net distributions. You might see shelters and campaigns set up, but obviously there's a lot of downsides to congregating people in close right now in temporary camps. So this was a real challenge. And I think COVID, we were already seeing some, backward steps in malaria. And the last World Malaria Report from the WHO suggests that at least in the the sort of highest transmission countries like Uganda and Congo, Nigeria, we're seeing some slippage in the gains that have been made over the last decade. It's probably due to insecticide resistance and new things developing. But I think COVID will accelerate some of that as well, and we'll see even sort of worst slippage in those areas. So it is a challenge, and I think I worry that COVID will impact a lot of these areas where there have been gains over the last decade. And it's certainly something that we're keeping an eye on at our areas, and will require some more research, but I'll stop there and just kind of stand by for questions at the end.
Thank you, Ross. We'll go straight to goal 4, which is quality education. And the target is, the focus is aiming to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Professor Kia Caldwell is of the African American and Diaspora Studies at UNC Chapel Hill. She's also the co-founder and director of the African Diaspora Fellows Program, also here at UNC Chapel Hill. Kia has a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Texas in Austin. The research of Kia, and who is also the co-founder and director of the African Diaspora Fellows Program, contributes to goal 4.7. Kia and Emily Chavez worked on, conducted a research and a book, and it ended up being a book entitled Engaging the African Diaspora in K-12 Education. So goal 4.7 is pretty much to ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. Their book, Engaging the African Diaspora in K-12 Education, provides in-service and pre-service teachers with valuable information and resources related to the African diaspora communities in the US, Europe, and Latin America. Kia, thank you for joining us. And I would, the floor is yours so you can share your work with us, please.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ada, for organizing this event and also for inviting me to participate. It's great to share this space with Dr. Gilpin and my colleagues from UNC Chapel Hill. And I also wanted to thank and acknowledge the African Studies Center, because the center provided financial and logistical support for the African Diaspora Fellows Program and also for our book, which Ada mentioned, and has really been a strong partner in this work for the past 6 years, especially Stacy Sewell and Barbara Anderson, who's the former Associate Director of the African Studies Center. So the African Diaspora Fellows Program was founded by Emily Chavez and I, along with colleagues at UNC Chapel Hill, Duke University, the Durham Public Schools, and the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, which is our statewide K-12 education agency. We founded the program back in 2014, really as a way to enhance professional development for teachers, middle and high school teachers here in North Carolina. We realized that many teachers were not aware, as we see in current debates, of the full range of experiences here in the United States, but especially of Afro-Latin American communities and experiences. And we really wanted to intervene in that space. So we held 2 summer programs for teachers in 2015 and 2016, and then 14 teachers from across the state were year-long fellows with us during 2016, 2017. They also each created curriculum resource guides for other educators on our web, and these are available on our website, which you can access through the departmental website, which is aad.unc.edu. Several are also included in our book, and I have the book here. I spared you a slide today, but the book is here. It's available online. And just to give you a sense of some of the topics that were covered in these curriculum resource guides, they are on topics such as developing and maintaining identity and other forms of resistance to the transatlantic slave trade, the Haitian Revolution, and also analyzing activist texts from abolition to hashtag Black Lives Matter. So these really provide teachers with a framework for incorporating this type of content into their own classes. I do think what we've done in terms of the African Diaspora Fellows Program and also our book is timely. The book came out earlier this year, and we actually did a virtual launch in July. So this was in the midst of nationwide and global protests regarding police violence, racial injustices, systemic racism. And also as we think about the recent debates here in the US about the 1619 Project, diversity trainings and the executive order banning different types of anti-racist trainings here in the US, we can see that historical knowledge continues to be an important cultural and political battleground. And as someone who actually does most of my work in Latin America, I'm really interested in the links to the African continent as we think about educational content. And as we think about Sustainable Development Goal 4, I do think it's really important that we develop curricular materials that enable students to more fully and accurately learn about the African diaspora. What students learn and how they learn really is critical to ensuring that they receive a high quality education. So I think our challenge now with the African Diaspora Fellows Program is continuing to get funding. We had funding for an initial period, but sustaining this type of program as we think about sustainability is more difficult, and particularly in the context of the pandemic as universities face tighter budgets. I do think, and perhaps Dr. Gilpin could help us with this, I think it would be good to link to the UN's International Decade for People of African Descent that is ending in 2024. So as we think about education, it's not only about where students are learning, but also what they're learning, and building these bridges, I think, in many ways between the continent and the diaspora. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kia. So goal 5 is gender equality, and it aims to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. In the video and in our work on this topic, we highlight the work and contributions of Professor Emily Burrell. Emily is an associate professor with the Departments of History and Women's and Gender Studies at UNC Chapel Hill. She's also the director of the African Studies Center. Emily received her BA in anthropology from Mount Holyoke College, her MA in history from the University of Vermont, and her PhD in history from Stanford University. Hi, Emily. Hi, please share your work with us.
Thanks a lot, Ada, and thanks to my colleagues for being here today for this rich discussion, and to Raymond, to Dr. Gilpin for joining us. So I'll just speak really briefly about how I see my research intersecting with Goal 5. So I'm a historian. I'm a gender historian who focuses largely on the 20th century, and I look at questions that pertain to law and society. And so the way I see my more recent work engaging with SDG 5 on gender is the work that I've done actually with a co-collaborator here at UNC. That's Professor Lydia Boyd in the same department as Kia, African American and Diaspora Studies. We just edited a book that was the culmination of a project of many years on legislating gender and sexuality in Africa. And what I did in that volume was to parlay my deeper historical interests in questions like the ones that Ashu posed actually when he was speaking. My historical interest in questions about how citizens make claims on the state and how subjects, that is people who are colonial subjects, make claims against formal institutions of power in order to create the lives that they want to live within constrained conditions. That's how I think about the work that I do. I transferred those questions and those interests in work that up until now I've really focused on up until the 1970s to really look at the 2000s. So if we think about the 2000s as a historical context to examine, what do we see? What do we see through the lens of gender equality, and how is this tied to goal 5? And then at the end, I'll say a little bit about how COVID just explodes the moment that we're in. So there are 3 things I'll say briefly in the time that we have. The questions I pose in my work on the more recent context is, how do we think about girls and education and the move to encourage girls to go to school? So this intersects with goal 4, actually, which Kia was just speaking about. So the question is, how do we encourage girls to go to school and stay in school while engaging in critical and authentic ways with how local communities themselves define empowerment, particularly when how local communities might think about this thing that we call empowerment runs up against how top-down notions of empowerment are framed. So that's a question that I'm really interested in. And the way that I'm exploring that question is largely in conjunction with an anthropologist who works in Niger, also in West Africa. This research on girls and education and empowerment, this tricky question of empowerment, helps us to understand how we might want to look more closely at how grassroots organizations, families, everyday individuals, citizens, engage with top-down institutions that are tasked with, quote unquote, empowering girls. Where does the conversation flatten? Who gets left out of that conversation? And how can we do the work that we need to do to get more people at the table to ensure that girls have access to the different options that make sense for them in their lives, namely through school and education? So that's a question that I'm interested in supporting and exploring as a contemporary history predicament. The second one that captures my attention in my teaching and in my research is the question of women in formal political leadership on the continent. So one of the things that's really fascinating about women in formal leadership on the continent is that since 2000, we've seen a massive uptick in women taking on elected positions in cabinets as heads of state, heads of institutions all over the continent. But we especially see this in what we might think of as post-conflict societies in Africa. So Rwanda, Uganda, Liberia, Sierra Leone. It's remarkable to see the role that women are playing in these formal leadership positions. One of the questions that historians and political scientists ask is, why is this happening and is it sustainable? The answer to the question of why, we think we understand. One has to do with the formal institutionalization of quotas that are working in some contexts, that is gender quotas that require and encourage the appointment of women to formal positions of power. In this book that I just referred to, that I edited on legislating gender and sexuality in Africa, there's actually a really interesting chapter by one of our former PhD students in anthropology. She was actually a student of Colin West's, but I also worked with her. I worked with her in her research. Her name is Lisa Kage Nebie Mbudo. And one of the things that she argues is that quotas can often mask inequality, though. Quotas become ways of checking off a box, but masking what continue to be socially inscribed power imbalances. And so when we look at quotas as markers of success, we also need to look deeper at bigger questions about social formation and how these things align. And then the last thing I'll say really briefly on time, because of time is actually what my real research is on. So I'm really interested in women's legal aid societies and the work that paralegals and women are doing on the ground in local organizations in places like Mali and Senegal to help other women learn about what their rights are before the state. That is what they're, again, going back to this point that Ashu was making, what are the claims that they can make before the state, particularly regarding gender-based rights and laws. So one of the things that I've become really interested in is how women's legal aid organizations in Mali made the first successful claim for the protection of women's rights before the African Court of Human Rights in 2008. 2010 actually is when the case came before the African Human Rights Court. This case is fascinating because a local women's rights organization in Mali brought the state of Mali, the Republic of Mali, to court, claiming that the Republic was not upholding the Maputo Protocol and that they needed to go back to the drawing board and re-examine the ways in which they were failing to uphold the rights of women. And this was the first time there had been a successful case heard before the African Court of Human Rights, where women's rights was not a rider to another claim that was appearing before the court, but it was the central claim. So I'm interested in that as a legal precedent. I think it's fascinating. And COVID raises all sorts of questions about the capacities, for me, questions about the capacities of these women's legal aid organizations and doing the work that they're doing. I think this point also that Ashu was making about the fact that the service sector seems to be hit really hard by COVID. If we look at who these legal aid societies are, it's women, it's mostly women who are educated, who are doing work in a service, sort of what you might think of as this middle service sector level of outreach. I haven't done this research yet because of COVID, because I'm in my house in Carborough, but I want to know how this is affecting their ability to do outreach in communities in Africa. And so I'll stop there for time, but I'm interested in hearing what Dr. Gilpin might say about those types of questions.
Thank you, Emily. Last but not least is Goal 6, which seeks to ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. For this video and this goal, we highlight the Water Institute, which is here at UNC. The Water Institute was established in 2010 as a platform to mobilize the knowledge, expertise, and resources across the University of North Carolina to address global water challenges. The Water Institute is headed by Dr. Aaron Salzberg and has more than 50 faculty and researchers across UNC. Dr. Salzberg is the director and the Don and Jennifer Halsworth Distinguished Professor in the Department of Environmental Sciences and Engineering at UNC. He holds a PhD in genetic toxicology and a master's degree in technology and policy from MIT. He also holds a master's degree in aerospace engineering from the University of Maryland. Thank you, Aaron, for joining us, and I welcome you to share your work and the work of the Institute with us.
Thanks, Ada. And it does make sense. A lot of people argue that water challenges are probably rocket science. I'll tell you, I think they're actually harder. And that comes from a true rocket scientist. Look, I think there may be some debate within this group. I'm going to be very quick, but arguably nothing is going to be more important to the human health, economic development, and peace and security than water and sanitation. It underlies nearly every one of the SDGs and is a major part of many of the issues that Raymond, Ross, Emily, and others have already mentioned. You know, our goal at the Water Institute is really to help contribute to a more water secure world. We are really focused on real world problems. Our research is really focused on trying to improve both the policy and the practice of how we work on water, with the goal of changing the way the world works on these kinds of issues. And look, this includes expanding access to safe drinking water and sanitation, improving the governance and management of water resources for human health, water, food, energy security, for climate resiliency and better management of floods and droughts. And it includes preventing conflicts and promoting cooperation on transboundary waters. We're engaged in a wide range of activities. I won't go into all of them here. And in fact, I'll stop very shortly because I do want to leave time for discussion. But we cover everything from assessing and preventing risks to safe drinking water supplies. In fact, we completed a study about a year ago, which found that about 60% of rural water supply systems being installed across Africa are contaminated with lead. About an eighth of those systems have lead levels that exceed WHO standards, which are 10 times the standards that we have here in the United States, a critical issue facing the future of the continent. We work on ensuring the sustainability of water supplies for drinking water and for food production, improving environmental health within healthcare facilities, and the role of access to safe water, sanitation, other services within healthcare facilities in preventing the spread of healthcare-acquired infections. We do a lot on assessing the risks around the management of sanitation and wastewater, right? Because we all know this, Raymond, you know this well, 80% of the world's wastewater isn't getting treated before it goes back into the environment. And in fact, in Africa, that's even much, much higher. And it's only going to be a few years from now before we are knee deep in both surface and groundwater that's not usable because of the waste that we're dumping into it, either from agricultural or human sources. We are also involved in some of the most challenging issues facing the continent on water, such as the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. I personally was one of the lead negotiators jockeying between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan on these issues. And we continue to remain engaged, trying to advise parties who are involved in this process on potential ways forward for resolving that very important conflict, of course, right? We know obviously what's happening in Ethiopia right now is very troubling, but we also know that a productive and sound Ethiopia can change the Horn of Africa. And that is critically important to the stability and security and economic development of that region. I'll also highlight that we host the world's largest international conference on drinking water and sanitation. We just had it, in fact, last week. We did it virtually. We had over 3,500 participants, hundreds from Africa and across Africa. And in fact, I think the session that got the most attention, and this goes to some of the issues that Kia was talking about, was around systemic inequalities, and not around the inequalities that we work on and try to address every day in our work, but in fact, the inequalities that we're either reinforcing or exacerbating through our work, and how our work is actually contributing to the reinforcement of some of the very inequalities that we want to be able to address going forward. That session seems to have resonated more than almost any of the other conversations that we had around water. And I'd be happy, of course, to share that with you and the group. But maybe I'll stop there because I do want to leave lots of time for discussion. So over to you, Ada.
Thank you, Aaron. So yeah, thanks everyone for your submissions and contributions and questions. I know that I promised I was going to let everyone off at 3:30, but as always, when the conversation is interesting, we tend to spill over time, but I'm going to keep it to no more than 15 minutes past 3:30. And I do know that there are a few faculty members on here who need to jump off. Some need to catch a flight. If you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand and ask. But I do have one question that I can kickstart the process with, and it's directed to Dr. Gilpin. I wanted you to speak specifically to UNDP's university partnerships here in the US and opportunities for UNC faculty, if any.
Thank you so much. Apologies, I was trying to unmute myself. Thanks. Let me start by thanking colleagues for those very, very, very excellent research overviews. The problem we face, particularly in Africa, is not one that you would find in any development textbook or any social science textbook. It is multifaceted, it is evolving, and it is immediate. And this is why the diversity of views that we have heard and the different research projects are crucially important, because the decisions we make as a community to address these challenges have to be informed by evidence, not by guesswork. For too long across the continent, a lot of policy has either been by tradition or by guesswork. And so I'd like to applaud you for really doing some excellent research that would inform policy. At UNDP, we have a number of opportunities to partner with researchers and with research institutions. I'll just highlight a couple. One is with historically Black colleges and universities. A couple of months ago, we held a webinar, an international webinar that was hosted by the historically Black colleges and universities, including a couple in the Caribbean. And what we did was we were able to explore not just some of their research ideas, but a lot of teaching. Because somebody mentioned earlier, it is not how we teach, it is what we teach, it's what the students learn. And this is a partnership that we are growing. The next step beyond institutionalizing it and expanding it would be to now connect universities and colleges here in the United States with those across the African continent. Because I do believe that a lot of good work is being done in Africa, and collaborative ventures like this are crucial. Second, on a number of specific issues, we do engage with research centers and universities. One example would be recent work that we did on the socioeconomic impacts of COVID. We did a 10-country study on the diverse contexts. And then we partnered with Pardee University in Denver, and they did a lot of the international futures modeling for us. And so that's just one example of a specific university partnership. And there are, in all of your areas, a lot of opportunities, if not directly with the regional bureau, but also with some of the functional bureaus as well.
Thank you. I wanted to also ask specifically, like, if there is someone who's on the panel or someone who's listening that has some idea, how can they go about getting to see if it's something, if it's an intervention or research that you might be interested in? Is there a website that they can go to? Do they contact someone?
Short answer, yes, website. 2, send me an email directly.
All right. So it's okay if I share your email with the panelists?
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, Raymond. I have an audience question, and it's a question to, she says, what is the role of data availability? I'm sorry, I'm assuming Paddy is a she. Apologies for that.
Maybe a man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, Paddy. What is the role of data availability, quality, access, and disaggregation in ensuring we are on real track to achieving the SDGs? I guess it's pretty much, role of data, validity of this data, considering what we know about the data challenges in Africa, especially. And there's also a second question about what mechanisms are mainstreamed in monitoring and ensuring we are driven by accurate data. It's still a question about data. And I don't know if, Raymond, you want to respond, or if anyone in the panel wants to respond to that question as well.
In the chat shows you have an opportunity to ask a friend, right? I do have a couple of colleagues online that I want to put on the spot. Senior advisors in the Regional Bureau for Africa, and they have joined. Eunice Kamwendo and Angela Lusigi. Either one of you, if you have anything to add on the data. I know that Angela is now working on a project in the Horn of Africa that's doing just that, doing a human development index in the Horn of Africa that not just informs our analysis, but hopefully would also help influence policy and practice in and around the Horn of Africa. So I put them on the spot. I do apologize.
And I've upgraded them so they can talk. So
Okay.
Eunice and Angela, if you are listening, you can unmute yourself and share with us, please.
Probably not.
No, yeah.
But
well, maybe while we're waiting, I mean, I can add just a couple of thoughts. I mean, one, no question, right? Critically important, and we do rely on the countries to be able to generate this data, and building their capacity to be able to do this is absolutely essential. But there's also a real twist and a wrinkle here, and it's particularly true with water, but some of the others. Many countries in Africa will not meet the SDGs. And that's going to unleash a lot of criticism. And unfortunately, I don't think that that's founded. We have to be very careful here. Providing SDG level of access to water or sanitation to first-time communities is almost impossible. And the SDGs are aspirational. The goal is to measure progress towards achieving the SDGs. And I really think, particularly in Africa and particularly in the most marginalized communities, we have to look at measuring that progress forward, and not just whether or not they've attained the highest levels of service. And that measuring of progress forward is incredibly complicated and very, very challenging, right? And so, because I want to be very careful about us coming out, when we start reporting all this data over the coming years and start saying, oh, all these countries are not meeting these targets and everything else. But they're actually making tremendous progress in getting people at the lowest ladder up a rung, and then these people up another rung, and these people up another rung, and everybody is shifting up. Because that's what you want to see, and that's the progress we want to be able to measure, is that over time, that we're progressively improving the lives of these people across the entire range of SDGs. And that's really difficult to measure. And I know it's the subject of a lot of discussion within the data analysis branches of the UN system and the statistical division and others who are looking at all these metrics and monitoring.
Yeah, but if I may just add, Aaron, very quickly, one of the things that we are able to do, and like working with us would be, that will be an opportunity as well. We do have a network of economists who are deployed in country and work with the statistical offices in various African countries. And so that's as closest to the data you can get, a lot of technical competence, and being able to piggyback on that helps a lot with the data availability and also data integrity issues. As regards the difference between having spot aspirational data and focusing on trends, you're absolutely right, because there is no single glide path to any one of the 17 SDGs. There are going to be shocks, there's going to be COVID, there are going to be surprises. And so the ability to be flexible and adaptable as things evolve becomes really, really important. And that's where the trend side becomes more important.
Yeah, and I think if I might add just a brief element to the conversation, this is just a moment to give a shout out to Measure and to the Carolina Population Center at UNC, among other institutions. These are units, cross-disciplinary units at UNC that work with very big data sets that tackle exactly these questions, and a lot of us interface with these units in different ways. By Russ has to log off. But I just wanted to say, one of the things that I find troubles me, maybe troubles is too strong a word. One of the things I grapple with as a qualitative social scientist is how we integrate big data, hard data that we need in order to work through these indices that we're trying to establish. How do we work with that data in conjunction with information on cultural values, on questions regarding power. We always need to keep in mind how we understand the ways that we assess the data that we gain, and keep in mind different kinds of questions about access, power, and meaning. And it's just something that, for me, these are the things I struggle with in my own work. That's all that I wanted to say about that.
I think Eunice is online. Yes.
Yes, she is.
Hi, Eunice.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much, and
Very well.
Raymond, for putting us on the spot. But I wanted to piggyback on what Aaron said. So we, from the Regional Bureau for Africa, we do produce annual reports on progress and sustainable development goals on the continent. And we do this, of course, in collaboration with the Economic Commission for Africa, the AU, and the ADB. And you're absolutely right. It's very, very difficult to measure progress when you can only find data, for example, credible data for at least 37% of the entire spectrum of the goals. So that's challenging. And it's the report itself, although we produce it, we do precisely what you talked about, as in we're really just measuring progress, not necessarily to meet the goal, but we want to see movement towards the goal. And I think that's really important. But part of what we do, and you will see across all the different goals, the availability of data, of course, it's very varied. You have some that you do have adequate data on. All of those on economic, for example, a lot on poverty and so on, you can find data. But you go into issues of water, SDG 6, and then the other, a lot more, for example, infrastructure and SDG 11, 12, and more especially on the environmental goals, that they haven't been fully also defined in terms of, the targets and so on. It's very, very difficult to measure. But what the report helps us do is to put a spotlight on these issues so that governments then can invest, but not only governments, but ourselves as development partners can invest in building capacity for data and so on and so forth. And one critical area that we've also discussed and worked on a little bit as partners is exactly what Emily talked about, the use of, where there's no official data, then we are actually encouraging ourselves to use open source data, big data, and so on, at least as a proxy, but at least it points towards certain directions in that sense. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to that, though, I think Emily's point about the conscious and unconscious biases that we as scientists and other data collectors are using around data, particularly in environments like Africa, are very challenging. And I very much worry that we need to deeply consider some of those issues. But Raymond, maybe a quick question for you, if you're willing, because I very much worry that the SDGs have changed the way donors approach development work, particularly in places like Africa, but across the world, and that we're moving away from governance reforms. And the importance of governance reforms, which I think underlies our ability to actually address all these issues, is really being neglected as we all try to press to reach certain numbers and targets related to the SDGs. What's your sense about that dynamic? And I know this is, of course, UNDP. I worked with Occam years ago. I know this is critically important for UNDP to focus on these governance kinds of issues. Where are we, and what kind of science would help you in being able to put governance issues back into the limelight as a priority for investment among donors?
Thank you. Excellent question. Governance, as you rightly pointed out, is fundamental. There is, and there has been, truth be told, particularly over the last decade, a rush to try to address the new and the sexy. How could we report at the end of the period that we have moved X number of clicks towards SDG X or Y, and that is what triggers the next round of funding. But it might be an interesting statistic, but it really does not move the needle in terms of sustainable, equitable, and broad-based growth on the continent. What we have done in the Regional Bureau for Africa is in articulating our strategic offer, which is not just our guidebook, but what we hope influences the way African stakeholders and the development partners think, is that we have highlighted governance in a number of ways in that document, but we prioritized it in the strategic offer. And we didn't call it governance, we called it the governance of things, because we want to not just highlight it, but move people away from this traditional view of governance being about what governments do, to governance being about how you manage what you have to get where you want to go. And it's at a multi-level issue. And so we do articulate it there, and the hope is that this then becomes becomes a lodestar for us as we think about how we redefine development in this evolving space. I keep saying that COVID gives us an excellent opportunity to reset and reboot. And our hope is that we would return to the trend lines on a number of issues, including governance in this post-COVID, because it's the pandemic has unearthed the dearth of work in this area and the importance. But just one quick thing before I close. It's been really refreshing to be able to just hear you from your different vantage points, and being able to probably have this kind of a conversation scaled up would be precious. Because that's what we want on the continent, because unfortunately, development has been projectized on the continent. And development is no longer a principle or a core value or something that guides the way we do our work. It is how many of X projects could we do in Y amount of time? And we really have to go back to what's our visioning here? Where do we all want to take this, take the continent? And what are the pathways there, and how do we ensure that we're able to utilize the resources optimally to get us there? And my hope is that this will be the beginning of a number of conversations, and we'll definitely come knocking to just get your viewpoint, but the broader academic space as well. I'm not sure if okay, no, let me not put colleagues on the spot, but we do have something called the African Economic Conference, which we host annually in collaboration with the Economic Commission for Africa and the African Development Bank Group. And one of the things we hope to be able to do in that space is to co-create and curate ideas and perspectives like this.
Raymond, just briefly, when is that conference going to be next convened?
Early December.
Okay, excellent. That was a really excellent way to wrap up the discussion, Raymond, because one of the goals that we have here at the African Studies Center through the SDG project, and as you pointed out, this is the beginning of what we hope is a much longer term conversation, and one that we would be interested in scaling up. This is the first installment of our engagement with all of the SDGs in a way to show how researchers, faculty, graduate students across UNC's schools are engaging with the SDGs to show our breadth and to show how the SDGs raise different types of possibilities and goals for advancement. So I want to thank Dr. Raymond Gilpin for joining us. I want to thank our other new colleagues, Eunice Kamwendo and Angela Lusigi, for stepping up when we asked them to engage, and my colleagues Kia Caldwell, Aaron Salzberg, Ross Boyce, Ashu Handa, Rudy Mansfield, Colorado. Thank you to Ada Umanwaliri, our associate director, who conceptualized this project, and to Stacy Sewell. Join us again. This will be this is the first conversation. Please, everyone, be on the lookout for more information about events with us, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.